Good morning. Are you familiar with the name Stephen Girard? No? How about the name William Wilberforce? Now, if you're like most people, you will have heard the name Wilberforce and be familiar with it, but not Stephen Girard. But actually, the two men were contemporaries. They lived at the same time. Now, let's consider the lives of those two men. At the end of his life, Wilberforce was forced to settle the debts run up by other members of his family. And so he ended his life poor, so poor that he had to rent out his house, and he survived by visiting family and friends for the rest of his days. On the other hand, Stephen Girard was the richest man in the world in 1820. He was so rich that in the War of 1812 between America and Britain, Stephen Girard was the chief source of credit for the US government. Now, if you looked at their bank accounts in, say, 1830, you might conclude that Wilberforce was poor and Girard was rich. Yet which of those men was truly the richest? And which of them had the greatest impact upon the world? Or perhaps take a nobody of a prisoner in a Roman jail in AD 67 called Paul. He's about to be executed on the orders of the Roman Caesar. Now, Caesar, the Roman emperor, rules over one of the greatest empires in the history of the world. He's fabulously wealthy, and he has the power of life and death over the millions of people in his empire. A power that he's about to apply to the nobody of a prisoner called Paul. Yet, even though it may seem that Caesar was rich and Paul poor, as the historian F. Bruce has said, isn't it remarkable that we name our dogs Caesar and our sons Paul? So once again, we must ask ourselves, which of these men was truly the richest, and which of them had the greatest impact upon the world? Psalm 112 is all about true wealth and the truly wealthy person. As the psalm tells us, such a person is gracious and compassionate. He or she is generous and lends freely. He conducts his affairs with justice and scatters abroad his gifts to the poor. His or her behaviour will not only positively impact their generation and the people around them now, it will flow on to future generations. The children of these people will be mighty in the land. So, what's the secret? How do people become truly rich in this way? Riches not of monetary wealth, but of true wealth, wealth in God's eyes. A wealth not of coins in a bank, but a wealth that makes a real and positive impact in this world. Well, Psalm 112 tells us. It tells us all the way through the psalm. It tells us in the first verse. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who finds great delight in his commands. The whole of Psalm 112 continues in this vein. It follows this pattern of intertwining love and obedience to God with mercy and grace and compassion to others. For it is love and obedience to God that leads us to do good to others. And so ultimately we become truly wealthy in that we are wealthy in God's eyes. We make a positive difference in this world. Jesus told us in Matthew 22 that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second greatest commandment is to love our neighbour as ourselves. And we find in practice that those two commands are inseparably joined. You cannot truly love God without in time coming to love your neighbour. Likewise, if you love your neighbour, you will love God in whose image your neighbour is made. That's spelled out for us in the book of 1 John. If you look at these two verses from 1 John chapter 4, we see how these two things of loving God and loving our neighbour are joined. Verse 12 says, "But if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. And verse 21 says, "And he has given us this command, whoever loves God must also love his brother." So you see, loving God and loving your neighbour, the two are inseparably joined. But what a blessing it is to live that way. Psalm 112 starts with the words, "Blessed are those who fear the Lord and find great delight in his commands." And we are blessed if we choose to live a life that is open-hearted and open-handed, because our focus is on God and upon building his kingdom. Psalm 112 tells us that such a person receives good. They're not shaken. They are steadfast and secure. But the psalm ends in verse 10 by contrasting this way of life with the person who rebels against God and does not live this way. That person may grasp at things in this world, but they will find that their longings will come to nothing. Psalm 112 is in line with Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus tells us not to try to store up treasure in this world, because that treasure is uncertain. It will decay or be stolen, but rather to store up treasure in heaven, where it will never be lost. The beauty of the life that God called each of us to, the life described here in Psalm 112, is that it blesses us, it does us good in three ways. Firstly, it's actually more fun to live this way. If you build God's kingdom first and spend yourself on behalf of the poor, you will find to your surprise that it's simply marvellous fun. The satisfaction that you get by being part of God's plan far surpasses any pleasure that you will get by holding on to the things of this world for yourself. When Ali and I opened a Christian orphanage in Africa in early 2003, we called it Grace. That was partly to reflect upon God's grace to the orphans, but even more to reflect upon God's grace to us in allowing us to be part of his plans. 17 and a half years later, I can tell you that name was well chosen. We have received so much joy from seeing that bit of God's kingdom grow and develop, but nothing else we could have done with the money that was needed to build and sustain the orphanage would have done us a fraction of the good that serving God has done us. It has been simply brilliant fun. But the second advantage of living in the way that Psalm 112 describes is that Jesus tells us that anything that we as Christians give into his kingdom is never lost. It never rusts or withers or fades away as things of this world do. Rather, it acquires an eternal significance. It has an eternal duration. Let me tell you that if you spend your life trying to grab hold of things in this world for yourself, you will die disappointed. Spend your life, your wealth, on God and his kingdom. You will have no regrets. You will be fulfilled. Thirdly, by living in this way, by living for God and being part of his plans, inadequate people like me, like you, like William Wilberforce, like the Apostle Paul, find that their lives make a real impact upon this world because they are walking hand in hand with the Saviour who is working all things out according to his good purpose and plans, and who is building a kingdom that will never pass away. God bless you, friends.